Well, welcome everyone to season 2 of Bob Bailey's 19th Century Baseball Speaker Series. And it's really been exciting. Season 1 was exciting, and this season 2 looks like it's going to be just as exciting, if not more so. We have a great lineup of people, and to reiterate what we're doing here is, in some cases, very few this time, we did go to people who had presented again at the Fred and asked them if they would enlarge their Fred presentation, which is about 20 to 25 minutes, to a duration of about 45 to 50 minutes. And then we put out an actual call for abstracts, giving their 40 to 45 minute presentation. So this year is a kind of hybrid. We have a handful of prior presenters at the Fred, and we have a handful of new presenters that have never presented before at the Fred, and they have a topic they wanted to put together for us. So this has proven to be pretty exciting, and we're looking forward to the whole year. Again, we're going to be doing this on every second Tuesday from now through May. So it is a kind of it follows a kind of academic year, September through May. I will say more about some of our upcoming other 19th century programs at the conclusion of the presentation. But for now, I would like to introduce the co-chair of the 19th Century Committee, Bob Bailey. And Bob, if you would take it from there, and everybody will. Whatever your ground rules are.
Yeah, a couple of notes for newcomers, and to remind those that have over the summer learning loss as we go forward. When we get when Bruce starts his presentation, please stay muted. We've had instances in the past where pets, kids, and spouses will enter the room, and suddenly we become part of a conversation. Not to mention all phones, radios, feedback, and any parakeets chirping. I have a Zoom meeting, regular meeting, that every Sunday morning we've got a parakeet we've got to quiet down. So please stay muted. However, we do take questions and comments through the chat function. If you run your cursor to the bottom of the screen, there should be a chat button that you can click. That will open a box on the right, where you can type in questions and comments, and through the presentation, Peter and I will monitor that, and we'll feed those back to Bruce at the end of the presentation. If you don't have chat on the bottom, go over to further to the right where it says more. Click that, and chat should be in that if you have extra icons already appearing. And third, let me introduce our speaker. Tonight's presenter is Bruce Allardice, professor of history and political science at South Suburban College in Holland, Illinois. Bruce is the author or co-author of I believe 6 books and a host of articles on the Civil War, in addition to his output on baseball topics. His baseball work has included articles and studies of 19th century baseball, particularly the spread of the game in the 19th century, and extensive work in the Black Sox scandal. In 2013, he received SABR's McFarland Award for his article, The Spread of Baseball in the South Prior to 1870. In addition to his writings, Bruce is the current editor of the SABR Origins Committee's newsletter, always an interesting read, and you can see the current and past issues on the Origin Committee's page on the SABR website. In fact, I believe it was earlier this week, first this week, that the September issue was released. Tonight, Professor Allardice's topic is Baseball in the Wild West, which explores the spread of baseball into the West at an earlier date than it's often thought of, and baseball connections to some of the classic personalities of the 19th century West. So Bruce, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Bob. Thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction, for allowing me to give this presentation to such a distinguished audience. Like I think most of you, I grew up watching John Wayne movies and Clint Eastwood, and Clint would usually shoot about 38 people during the movie, which is about one every 4 minutes or something like that. So I've always been interested in Wild West history and always interested in baseball history. And for this talk, I'd like to try and merge those two together, those two interests together, to tell you something about baseball in the early Wild West. Okay, I'm gonna start sharing my screen here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, and the screen, I'm gonna try and go full screen on this here.
There you are.
There we go. Looking good there. Oops, getting something there. Oops, there we go. Okay. Baseball in the Wild West. For many years, we've seen a lot of good and a lot of not so good Western movies and TV shows. And from those, we all have the image of the Wild West as a land of cowboys and Indians, shoot 'em ups, bank robberies, John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, Deadwood. But Major League Baseball and the West developed at the same time. The first year that the World Series was played, Butch Cassidy was still robbing banks. The Battle of the American Association and the National League is paralleled by the battle at the same year between the Apaches and US Cavalry. Jesse James and his gang robbed a bank in Corydon, Iowa in 1871, the same year that the first professional baseball league was formed. My talk tonight will emphasize the fact that there were a lot more baseball games played in the Wild West than there were shootings. As Major League Baseball develops, out west, cowboys and Indians are still fighting, and the legendary Western outlaws are robbing banks. Now, the definition of what is or was the Wild West and when the Wild West ended, those definitions vary. For purposes of this presentation, I'll adopt the formulation of historian Frederick Jackson Turner. And his thesis was that the frontier itself ended about 1893. And that the end of the Wild West is marked by the disbanding of the Wild Bunch Gang in 1903. With that, I'd like to do a little bit of timelining here. 1866, Vassar fields the first women's baseball team. And that year, Jesse James's gang robs its first bank. 69, the Cincinnati Reds are formed. And at the same year, the railroad is finished connecting East and West America. 1871, Jesse James robs his first train. And the National Association is formed. In 1876, the National League is formed. In that same year, Wild Bill Hickok is murdered. Colorado is admitted as a state. And Custer's last stand takes place. 1881, the Chicago White Sox win a pennant. The same year, there's the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. And that year, the famous outlaw Billy the Kid is killed. 1889, the Players League is formed. Well, and Butch Cassidy robs his first bank that year. 1890, Cy Young pitches his first game. The Wounded Knee fight occurs. 1903, the first World Series, the Wild Bunch disbands. And as late as 1916, when Boston Red Sox win the World Series, there you go, Peter. That's the year of the last stagecoach robbery in the United States. As a sort of introduction, I'm going to talk a little bit about George Armstrong Custer's 7th U.S. Cavalry. Now, there's no evidence that General Custer played baseball himself. However, his younger brother Tom was an avid baseball player on the regimental team. And Custer's third in command, Captain Fred Benteen, was not just an organizer of the
Unmute my audio.
regiment's baseball team.
Start video.
He had been a pitcher in 1860 for a Missouri amateur team even before the Civil War.
There you go.
Now, Benteen was assigned to the 7th Cavalry, which is under Custer, and they originally served at Fort Rice, which is 30 miles from Fort Lincoln, which is in near present-day Bismarck, North Dakota. And in 1873, Benteen organized a club, cleverly named the Benteen Baseball Club, representing Company H of that regiment. Another baseball club was formed at Fort Lincoln called the Actives, made up of soldiers from that garrison. And between 1873 and 1876, these clubs played against other military squads, against themselves, and against civilian teams. Benteen's soldiers purchased over a dozen bats and baseballs, and according to their own record, won 12 of the 17 games with other units in between fighting Indians. The Benteens beat E Company's Pick 9, which was made up of the garrison of Fort Randall. And the local newspaper stated, quote, "Neither team played up to their standard because of the high wind." When the Benteens lost a game, featuring plenty of betting to the 1st Infantry, the Yankton Press reported, quote, "It is hoped these two nines will meet again soon, as a large amount of money will probably change hands in such an event." When on the Black Hills expedition of 1874, the Actives defeated the Benteens 11-6 in a game of baseball on the site of present day, cleverly named Custer, South Dakota. Custer didn't witness this contest as they were climbing a nearby mountain that day. But a member of the 7th Cavalry wrote in his diary, "The soldiers whiled away the long summer day with a game of baseball, a genuine Black Hills first, including a dispute over the umpire's impartiality." Yeah, fans gripe about the umpires today. They griped about them in 1876 out west as well. In 1876, Custer led the 7th Cavalry in another expedition westward, this time to quell an Indian rising in Montana. Benteen was the commander of one of the 3 columns of soldiers that Colonel Custer divided his regiment into during the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is otherwise known as Custer's Last Stand. Benteen's column survived the battle, unlike Custer's. But most of the members of the baseball team were killed or wounded in the action. Speaking of Custer's Last Stand, here's how a Nebraska newspaper reported Custer's last stand. Headline on about Custer's massacre on the left, and then the next column talking about a local baseball game. In this instance, Custer received bigger headlines than the baseball game, but as I'll try and point out, quite often the baseball games got bigger headlines than the Indian fights. Now, of course, most of you know the essence of the game in the 1860s and 70s. Slow pitch or underhand pitch, really more a resemblance to modern softball that might otherwise be the case. Informal fields. And this was especially true out west. There were few or no prepared fields, grandstands, or diamonds anywhere west of Kansas City. I've been working with the Protoball database, especially to try and find the first baseball game anywhere in the United States, and especially in the Wild West. And what I found is, after a town is founded in the Wild West, within 3 to 5 years, they have a baseball team. And just as the immigrants from the East brought their culture, they brought their belongings, they brought their farm implements, they brought with them the love of baseball and bats and balls. And as we'll see in the Wild West, there were more baseball games than gunfights by a large measure. This is probably a very sure sign that baseball has arrived in the Wild West. Here's Waterville, Kansas. There's an ad for baseball equipment at the local drugstore. That shows you baseball has really planted itself. Here's another ad from the then pretty wild town of Atchison, Kansas in 1870. Evidently, somebody named Heim has a lot of baseball goods. This is the ad. Not very clever, but a lot of repetition. Another sign that baseball had arrived early in the Wild West. This is from an 1867 newspaper in Virginia City, Montana, which was a gold rush town at the time. Won't say that's the greatest poetry in history. Somebody probably put it to music too, just from the rhythm of the poem, but they're even as early as 1867, frontier newspapers are writing poems about baseball. Well, we hear about umpires robbing games these days. Well, this one is an actual robbery. This is from the Veneta, Oklahoma Chieftain of 1899. Evidently, after the town of Wagoner played Muskogee in a baseball game, some of the Wagoner team came up at the local store and they tried to rob the store. They killed the night watchman with a shot. 6 were captured, thrown in jail, and who knows whether they were hung or not. But the newspaper is actually more worried about what Wagner is going to do for baseball players after the six robbers have been caught. Games out west could be pretty rough and tumble. One day around 1902, the Fort Worth Panthers traveled to Cleburne, Texas to play the local club, their hot rivals. The score was tied with 2 outs in the bottom of the 9th, with the home team having a man on third. The next Cleburne batter lofted an easy fly to center field. On a normal day, it was an easy out. But along the outfield fence line, sitting on horseback, were between 300 to 400 cowboys, each wearing a 6-shooter on their hip. As the batted ball began its descent, 5 of the cowboys drew out their pistols, took aim at the baseball, and started blasting away. When the dust settled, all that remained of the baseball was a cloud of twine lying on the outfield grass. The umpire was visibly shaken. Didn't know what to say. They figured since the ball had not been caught, he ruled that there was no out made. He pointed at the runner at third, who had been frozen at third with all the shooting and everything, and waved him across the plate with the winning run of the baseball game. This is perhaps the most bizarre walk-off run in baseball history. The backstory of this is that the umpire and the Fort Worth players very quickly and very wisely left town as soon as possible. Towns out west fostered great town baseball rivalries. Of course, this is a picture of the Tombstone, Arizona team, but the story I'm going to tell is from the great pitcher Smokey Joe Wood, who grew up in Ouray, Colorado, literally on the frontier at that time. And he recalled how a small western town's community pride often rode on their town baseball team. Quote, "The smaller the town, the more important their ball club was. Boy, if you beat a bigger town, they'd practically hand you the key to the city. And if you lost a game by making an error in the 9th inning or something like that, well, the best thing you could do was just to pack your suitcase and hit the road because they never let you forget it. In places like Ouray, the teams carried with their bats the town's honor, followed by a lot of local money, which was bet on them too. Many of the original baseball games played out in the Wild West were games and teams composed of the soldiers stationed. This is the Fort Union, New Mexico baseball team of 1888, taken at Las Vegas, Nevada. Excuse me, Las Vegas, New Mexico. Las Vegas was New Mexico back then, by the way. Nobody paid any attention to Las Vegas, Nevada at that time. And many of the officers, like Captain Benteen and Colonel Custer, encouraged their soldiers to get involved in sporting events. This lists the first baseball game or club formed by state for the states in the Wild West. 1858, Kansas and California. 1859, Utah. 1861, Colorado. 1864, North Dakota. Arizona, Wyoming, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, 1866. New Mexico, Washington, Nebraska, Alaska, 1867. Idaho, 1868. Oklahoma and South Dakota in 1869. Notice that all the states in the Wild West have baseball before the 1871 date when the first professional baseball league was formed. Most of these states weren't even states, they were territories at the time. And again, if you want to see more about the spread of baseball, more of the detail, visit the protoball.org website, which I think is the best single source for games. We have now about 12,000 different games, early games and early clubs entered into the website. Just to give you some examples, in May of 1866, the first known baseball team in the Northwest was formed in Oregon, the Pioneer Baseball Club of what was then East Portland. The Portland squad soon recorded a 77-46 victory over Clackamas. Hope I'm pronouncing that correctly for Oregoners there. A year later, two Texas teams faced off on the San Jacinto Battlefield near Houston on April 21st, the anniversary of the Battle of San Jacinto, where Texas had won its independence by defeating Santa Anna's Mexican army. The two teams were the Stonewall and the Robert E. Lee. That gives you some idea of the fact that they were Southern teams. In a lopsided contest that didn't last much longer than the battle did, the Lee Stonewalls blasted the Lees 35-3. In 1867, in Kansas, the Frontier Baseball Club formed in Leavenworth, Fort Leavenworth, and the game quickly spread to Lawrence, Topeka, to other towns. As we'll see later, Wild Bill Hickok, the famous Western Marshal, reportedly rooted, was a fan of the Kansas City Antelopes. Legend has it that he even umpired some of their games, wearing, of course, his six-shooters on his side. That's one way to make sure that nobody disputes the umpire's decisions. In October 1869 and 1870, two clubs in Utah faced off with each other for a Utah State Championship. It turned out that the Corinne Baseball Club beat the Ania of Salt Lake City in a 3-game series that summer. So you see, very early on, they were having state championship games out west. Not too many years after baseball reached some of the major eastern cities. To compare the first baseball to statehood, well, on the right, you can see how many years before statehood these states had baseball, 3 years for Kansas, Utah had baseball 37 years before it became a state. Arizona, 46 years before it became a state. Oklahoma, 38 years before it became a state. And if you really want to go big on this, Alaska had a baseball team in 1867, 90 years before it became a state. Hawaii also, 1866, 90 years before it became a state. Some of the famous places out west that then their first baseball. Fort Hays, the wildest, vilest city in the nation, according to some people, when it was founded. 3 years after it was founded, they have a baseball team. Fort Fetterman, site of the massacre, famous massacre. 1 year after the fort was founded, baseball team. Abilene and Wichita, Kansas, Dodge City, Deadwood, South Dakota, where they had the great TV show. Tombstone, Arizona, Leadville, South Dakota. These are all places that are very famous in Western lore. And again, within a couple of years of their founding, they all had baseball. I'm going to be doing a little map thing right now to give you sort of a visual idea of the spread of baseball in the West. After that, I'll start telling you a few stories, but I'm going to take this from the Proto Ball database. This right here is baseball in 1860, where there were verified clubs or baseball games. As you can see, it's barely hit the South. 1 or 2 teams in Iowa, a couple in Missouri, a few teams in California and Minnesota, but basically anything west of Kansas City, there had been only Salt Lake City and Fort Scott, Kansas, so it's not a lot. What I'm going to do now is go to another screen here, and this is going to hopefully work. And what I'm going to try and do here is, oops, I'm sorry, I accidentally hit a stop button. Okay, this is 1860, 1861, 1862, 1863. You can see things piling up in the Midwestern states. 64, 65, 66. See the Oregon team there. Few teams in Nevada and the mining camps of the Rocky Mountains now. Arizona, 66, by the way. 68. See the map starting to get filled in. 1870. 71, 72, 73, 74. By the way, the red thing on these are games, the yellows are clubs. 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85. You can see that by 1885, which is still the middle of the Wild West, it's pretty well covered with verified games and clubs. Again, you can see from the map right up the Rio Grande River in New Mexico. There's a whole line of games there. In Colorado, just on the Denver side of the mountains there. The mining camps in western Montana. Along the Red River flowing in North and South Dakota. Around the Great Salt Lake. The gold fields of southern Idaho. And this area here, Arizona, that everybody thought was so dry that baseball would never really take hold there. Again, this I hope will give you sort of a visual of what baseball's expansion looks like geographically, at least. And I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint here. And just to give you an example from one state, I just picked South Dakota at random. Basically, in 1880, South Dakota had three, I'm simplifying greatly for South Dakota historians like Terry, but it had three basic centers of population. In the middle of the state around Fort Sully, eventually Peary, in the Dead Hills here around Deadwood, and the original settlement around Yankton in the southeast. And I marked an X with all the baseball teams and clubs in the state by 1880. And you can see how they're following the places where settlements had taken place. In 1869, Major League Baseball, or at least professional baseball, went west with the Red Stockings tour. In 1869, the Cincinnati Red Stockings became the first true professional team. Its players drawing salaries ranging as high as $1,400 a year. Wow. Mike Trout would not feel threatened by that kind of salary. That salary was paid to their star, George Wright, who had nothing less than $519 that year. Imagine $519 and all you get is a $1,400 a year salary. Well, that first season, the Reds posted a perfect 57-0 record against generally overmatched amateur teams. Late that summer, the Red Stockings traveled to California via steamboat and the newly opened Transcontinental Railroad. And in San Francisco, the Wright brothers and their colleagues defeated the Eagles, the Atlantics, and the Pacifics, local San Francisco teams, usually by at least 40-run margins. The San Francisco Chronicle praised the Red Stockings' athletic ability as well as their, quote, large and well-turned legs. On the return trip, the Red Stockings played 2 games in Omaha, Nebraska, first beating a local team 65-1. The game was called after 7 innings, not because of a slaughter rule, but because the local team's only catcher had to leave early. And they next day, they humbled another local 9, 56-3 in a 5-inning game. Professional baseball, in fact, maybe not Major League Baseball, but professional baseball made it out west relatively early, and just about as early as it made it to the American South. As early as 1885, Denver, Colorado headed a group of cities that formed the Rocky Mountain League. Teams from Denver, Pueblo, Leadville, Colorado, Salt Lake City, Hastings, and Arapahoe, Nebraska participated. Future major leaguer George Tabo hit .320 that year in a 21-game season. The Denver team hosted the visiting Major League Chicago Spaldings and St. Louis Enterprises. And all told, they went 5-6 against the major leaguers. So this is a pretty good team. In 1886, Denver joined the newly formed Western League, including teams in most of the same cities. All this professional baseball is going on 15 years before the Wild Bunch starts robbing banks and trains in these parts. The Western teams had some fun club nicknames: the 6-Shooter Gyms, the Knockdown and Skin 'em Club of Alaska. For those of you who don't get the reference, they were seal hunters. That was the big industry in Alaska before gold. And what you do with seal hunters would do with these seals to get their skins was knock them down and skin them. The Plug Hat Club, the O.B. Joyful Club, the No Stockings and Leather Breeches Club, have no idea. The Tough and Terrors Club, the California Bar Drinks Club, the Peculiar Club. There was even an anti-Chinese club in Eureka, Nevada. that played the Ruby Hill Baseball Club for a keg of beer. Well, this is a picture of Fort Hays in Hays City, Kansas, one of those wild cow towns of the early Wild West. Wild Bill Hickok was here from 1867 to 69, along with Buffalo Bill Cody. In 1868, Captain Albert Barnitz of the 7th Cavalry was stationed here, and in a letter to his wife reported that baseball clubs were very active among the officers and enlistment men, and that the officers had celebrated the 4th of July by playing a game of baseball. He admitted, quote, "I have not been to church because there was no church to attend. But in lieu of this, all the officers, including a half dozen from Fort Dodge, who were here on a visit, participated in a social game of baseball." In 1877, the Vance Baseball Club of Fort Hays played a team of local Pawnee Indians. One of your early, I guess you'd say, interracial games. The Hays boys won 18-15. We've all heard of Wyatt Earp, the famous Western Marshal. Well, he was in Wichita 1874 to 76, and he had many baseball connections. He was appointed policeman of Wichita by the mayor of the town, George Harris, who also happened to be the president of the local baseball team. Pictured on the right is Earp's fellow policeman and city marshal, Jim Carnes. Carnes played first base on this team. Wyatt's immediate boss, City Marshal Mike Maher, helped arrange a baseball tournament in which Wichita played against other Kansas clubs. And one additional connection, which we'll be getting a little bit later, Jim Cairns married Bat Masterson's sister. Following along with the Earp legend, Earp was a marshal in Dodge City from 1876 to 79. The cow towns, the railheads where Texas cattle would be driven, and as the railroad expanded west, the cow towns moved further west for reasons which I won't get into here, but if I had another 15 minutes, I could do so. Well, this is Dodge City, and it has a connection to the Chicago White Sox. The first game we found is July of 1878. Said on the 4th of July, the local paper said the town celebrated with a picnic, dancing on the grounds, and baseball. But baseball probably made it here as early as 1875. There is a story that future Hall of Famer Charles Comiskey, of course, the famous first baseman, owner of the White Sox, he attended St. Mary's College here in 1875 and played baseball on the college baseball team with future manager Ted Sullivan. Famed Western lawman and future sports writer Bat Masterson is said to have helped organize the first baseball team ever in Dodge City. Speaking of Bat Masterson, he is said to have gotten his nickname Bat from his youthful prowess on the baseball field. Now take that for what it's worth. He was founder and vice president of Dodge City's first baseball club. He served on the town's foot racing committee and refereed football games. Later in life, he was a sports columnist for the New York Morning Telegraph. According to a biographer, quote, Masterson's columns contained little sports news other than boxing. He was never a fan of baseball, a game he called, quote, almost as weird a sport as football. When he did mention baseball, it was usually to comment on the vast sums of money being wagered on the World Series. The columns were not distinguished by great writing. Masterson was given to excess verbiage, repetition, laced with slang and jargon, and the use of clumsy first-person plural pronouns. He delighted in the unusual word, preferably polysyllabic. A voracious reader, he bragged to his readers that he tried to learn 2 new words every day. Well, you may remember the TV series Deadwood. Great series, by the way. Legend has it that Earp had refereed games in Kansas City when Kansas City played Atchison, Kansas. Kansas City won the game 48-28. Again, you think the Blue Jays are scoring a lot of runs these days. Take a look at those scores. But nobody argued with Hickok's calls. He was murdered in 1876, and baseball formally arrived in Deadwood 2 years later. Jesse James, perhaps the most famous robber and outlaw in the West. Well, many of you know that his gang basically was shot to pieces when they tried to raid a bank in Northfield, Minnesota in 1876. What you may not know is that while scouting out Minnesota towns, trying to figure which one they'd want to rob the bank of, the James Younger gang attended a baseball game between the Winona Clippers and the St. Paul Redcaps. My research suggests that it's probably the August 24th, 1876 contest played in Winona. So these famous bank robbers were attending a baseball game in between planning one of their most famous robberies. This is a photo of the Apache baseball team connected with the famous Apache chief Geronimo at Fort Sill, Oklahoma in 1892. Oklahoma has a interesting history. Of course, you know, most of Oklahoma was an Indian reservation until 1889. But in early 1869, the 7th Cavalry was stationed at Fort Sill, and they routinely played baseball against the 19th Kansas Volunteers. Meanwhile, at the same time, the 10th U.S. Cavalry, the famous Buffalo Soldiers, were there and helping with the construction of the fort. According to one Kansan, in these games, the ball was an unidentified object, wrapped in yarn and covered with leather from an old boot. The Kansans defeated the 7th Cavalry 7-2, but the game was not without controversy. After the game, the 7th complained that the umpire, a trooper from the Kansas regiment, had favored his fellow Jayhawkers. One cannot find a more impressive demonstration of baseball's growing importance in the United States. Here in an obscure corner of the United States, in an area virtually unknown and unsettled, young men vigorously played baseball and squabbled about the umpiring. The second game between these two teams was none too successful either. According to the same diarist, quote, "The baseball game was almost a fizzle as the balls were knocked to pieces and they only had 2 baseballs." By late March, the homemade baseballs had started to unravel, and it was time for the Kansans to start returning home. The game of baseball was commonly played by Army garrisons throughout the West during this time. And at Fort Sill, especially from 1879 to 1900. Cash awards and other valuable prizes were often posted by the post-trader, William Quinnett. Usually they played on the 4th of July. Records actually exist regarding the, quote, King Nine, a cavalry baseball team from this fort, which traveled to Henrietta, Texas, and played the local teams there. And getting back to Geronimo, one unusual aspect of baseball history at Fort Sill is the fact that Native American teams were organized and actively played during the 1880s and 1890s. Troop L of the 7th U.S. Cavalry was reorganized at Fort Sill in 1890. Now you remember, most of the 7th Cavalry had been wiped out at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. This company was reorganized, consisting of Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache soldiers, as you can see there. Most of the Apache soldiers were, at least technically, prisoners of war. Yet all were armed, all wore uniforms, they received a salary, escorted payroll, chased outlaws, and served with distinctions as soldiers in the U.S. Army. Legend has it even Geronimo, who was a prisoner of war at this time, played baseball at Fort Sill. And still later, in 1951, a native Oklahoman by the name of Mickey Mantle would take a break from his baseball career to take his physical exam for Army service at Fort Sill. Well, this is a picture of the 1895 Tombstone, Arizona baseball team, coached by the man in the straw hat there, Sandy Bob Crouch. Coach Crouch was a figure in some of the most important aspects of the Tombstone OK Corral shootout. He had had his coach robbed by one of the Clanton McLaury gang, Frank Stillwell, in 1881. Wyatt and Morgan Earp arrested Stillwell for the robbery, and the Clantons and McLaurys, who were their Stillwell's associates, resented this, and that was one of the things that touched off the famous gunfight at OK Corral. Well, after the OK Corral shooting, Texas Tombstone needed new entertainment, so George Staples Rice, a civil engineer from Massachusetts, started a baseball team at one of the local silver mills in 1882. In May of 1882, the Tombstone Baseball Association was born. Said a local historian, quote, "It grew from there. The Tombstone team developed, Grand Central developed, Bisbee created a team, and they played each other all around the county. There was a lot more than just 3 local teams." And these were teams, they weren't outlaws, they weren't bandits. These were teams composed of Tombstone's leading citizens. And just to give you a feel for Tombstone baseball, this is a box score from the Tombstone Epitaph 3 months before the gunfight at the OK Corral. The Vizina team is named after a local mine owner and a local mine. And the Earp brothers had a financial interest in this mine. In fact, mine owner Jim Vizina helped bail Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday out after they were indicted for the Stillwell shooting. Here's a Billy the Kid Pat Garrett baseball card from 2010. Well, I've done all the research I can. As far as I know, neither of them played baseball. But they did have a lot of connections to Lincoln, New Mexico baseball. The earliest baseball team in Lincoln, Nebraska was sponsored by George Barber, a local attorney who married the widow of Alexander McSween. And if you know your Billy the Kid history, McSween was an ally of Billy the Kid and got killed while on the Kid's side at a shootout in Lincoln in 1881. In 1880, a year before he died, Billy the Kid tried to kill Deputy Sheriff Jim Redmond, who later was the second baseman on this Lincoln baseball team. Leadville, Colorado, mining boom town, about 1878 on. The unsinkable Molly Brown was from Leadville. What baseball team was Colorado's best ever? Well, some Colorado Rockies fans would pick one of their winning teams. I suppose the old timers would say one of the Denver Bears teams was pretty good. But for the 19th century, no debate is possible. The 1882 Leadville Blues swept all before them for one glorious season. You may never have heard of this team, but they were a team with a purpose. And the purpose was to salvage Leadville's reputation. In 1880, Leadville had suffered a disastrous year for a mining town. Their two biggest mines had shut down. They'd run out of ore. And there was a labor dispute going on between the owners and the miners. The boom days of Leadville were starting to disappear. Looking for some ways to improve their civic image and bring back investors, some Leadville mine owners decided to field a baseball club. And they weren't content with just any old baseball club, but they decided to bring the best they could hire from the East. One that would bring a championship home to the, quote, carbonate camp of Leadville. The result was the 1882 Leadville Blues. Leadville got 5 future or former major leaguers to bolster their local talent. One opponent queried if the Blues can handle the pick and shovel as well as they can bat. Well, of course, they never did any work there. Their work was just playing baseball. They were brought to Leadville for one reason only, and that was to win baseball games. You may not recognize some of the names there, but they were some of the best players who played on major league ball clubs in the East. The best of their players was pitcher and sometimes center fielder Dave Fouts, quote, a paralyzer and make no mistake. Fouts would play or manage in the major leagues for 13 years, and he achieved the second highest winning percentage, .690, for pitchers in major league history. With a few additions and deletions during the season, these were the core of the Leadville Blues, a nine made of, quote, paid men, most of them old professionals from the crack clubs of the Eastern League. The salaries, we don't know the salaries, but they must have been attractive to lure them to Leadville, Colorado, which is not near anywhere, and it's 10,000 feet above sea level. Even back then, as Connie Mack once observed, champions cost money. Excited Leadvillers caught a case of baseball fever by late May, despite some winter weather that dumped snow on the ground as late as June 1st. Said the Leadville Daily Herald, quote, Leadville has got the baseball fever so bad at present that one of the baseball nine cannot catch a baby falling out of the second-story window without looking around for an umpire. Leadville even built a stadium for these players. They wiped out the local teams. It's sort of their equivalent of spring training. Finally, in July, they were ready to tour around the West. They took the road against some of Colorado's best teams. The first game they got rained out when they were tied with the Colorado Springs Reds 7-7. The next day they went against their hated city rivals, Denver. They beat the Denver Browns 30-5, and the Denver Tribune moaned, quote, baseball isn't much of a game anyhow. The Browns could never match the Blues, and they lost to them 4 times during that season. Leadville could crow dominance over Denver, and they did so. Coming home, they defeated the Colorado Springs Reds. Or as the local paper quaintly reported, quote, the Leadvillians gave the boys from the aesthetic city, Colorado Springs, I guess, such a drubbing that they will never forget it as long as they are in existence. That's quite a buildup considering the final score was only 8-1. They beat Buena Vista 42-1. They beat Bonanza 47-0. They won 5 of 6 games against the Longmont Utes. And they claimed the championship of Colorado that year. They then decided to leave Colorado and tour east. At first, all went well. They defeated the Hastings, Nebraska Reds and Omaha's Burlingtons and Missouris. Then they went to Council Bluffs, Iowa to play the local team there. Shockingly, the Leadville team lost all 3 games. Leadville papers complained about being, quote, hometowned unfair umpiring, and damnable robbery. More to the point, however, the Council Bluffs team had imported some of the Chicago White Sox to temporarily play for them for this series. The Leadville Blues in 1882 had a 34-win, 8-loss record, .809 percentage. But they had not revived Leadville's reputation or fortunes. They'd keep on having teams at Leadville, but they were never that good. The professional players went back east to play, and they drifted into obscurity again. Well, from the serious baseball to the not so serious. The silver mining camp of Silver City, New Mexico took all of 3 years after its founding to organize a baseball team. The Silver City mining life purported of the team's 1873 formation by calling the sport, quote, bone breaking and, quote, joint dislocating. New Mexico had a lot of baseball teams during this era. And in 1887, Silver City decided to go one better than the other teams. They had a burlesque baseball featuring contests between the fat people of town and the lean people of town. The thin fellows, known as the Slim Jims, and they're on your left there, you can see they wore white suits decorated with skull and crossbones, and they carried dudish canes. The large fellows, appropriately called the fat fellows, I'm quoting here, wore suits bearing decorative beer mugs, as you can see there. The Nines marched to the baseball diamond to music headed by Professor Langer's band and drum major Fritsch. But the team's humor extended far beyond the uniforms. Quote, the ice wagon was on hand, rigged up as an ambulance, and stationed at third base with a plentiful supply of beer, which the Jolly Teuton, who handled the lines, dealt to the players who reached third base. The saloon keeper was uniformed as a Dutch peasant with wooden shoes and wore a government hat. A gift of beer when you reach the third base? Sounds pretty good to me. I played a few games where that's happened. An umpire armed with a big revolver officiated the game, and the Slim Jims thought they would win by tiring out the big guys. They were mistaken. Quote, the pitcher and catcher of the big men did the business, and the muscle of the monsters sent the balls away over the heads of their fellows of match-like form, the paper reported. The fat fellows won by a score of 20-6. You may remember the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Again, I've not been able to locate where Butch Cassidy ever played baseball, but while he was in prison in Wyoming in 1894, Butch witnessed, and for all I know, may have played in baseball games played among the prisoners. Another Western legend, Buffalo Bill Cody and his Wild West show. This is an ad for when he brought his show to Chicago at the old Cubs West Side Park, August 19th to 27th, 1916. And this is a picture of the Wild West show being put on in the park. But this is not the only Buffalo Bill baseball connection. On Sunday mornings, September 8th, 1895, St. Cloud, Minnesota citizens awoke to the sounds of workers unloading animals and equipment from 59 railroad cars. This was Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And in a marvelously short time, the tents had been erected and shows were being put on. But on Sunday, a team of local baseball players challenged the men from Cody's show to a game of baseball. And the event soon turned more into a melee than a regular baseball game. During the first inning, the local first baseman tripped one of the Wild West players as he was headed to second base. According to the local St. Cloud newspaper, quote, the visiting team ran over and expostulated. You don't see that word used much in sports reporting today. Expostulated with the first baseman for his yellow play, but peace was restored without any serious difficulty. In the second inning, the local catcher accused the Wild West's first baseman of kneeing him. A potential riot ensued with members of both teams, and it's only stopped when policeman John Quinlivan drew out his revolver and fired some shots. The game ended with the local team winning 10-2. And to end up, can anyone name this six-shooting cowboy? Boy, he looks like a mean one, doesn't he? Big, strong, mean guy. Well, it's not going to be a quiz question for this semester or for anything like that, or for you to get graded on. This is, in fact, Lou Gehrig from the 1938 film Rawhide. I don't know how many of you have seen that film. I did. It's actually not that bad a movie. He doesn't do that bad a job acting, but he's a lot better baseball player than he is an actor. Let's just put it that way. There's one scene where a bunch of roughs try to attack him in a billiard hall. And he grabs these billiard halls, and you just can't believe how he just whizzes those fake baseball, boom, 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 and knocks everybody out before they can get to him. He's out there to help his sister with a ranch, and some local cowboy, gets in love with the sister, and he saves the ranch and defeats the bad guys and everything. So if you're looking for a pleasant hour and 10 minutes of entertainment that doesn't take itself too seriously, this movie's worth watching. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'd like to thank you for being with me tonight. And again, I'd like to thank Pete and Bob for inviting me to speak. Thank you again.
Bruce, thank you very much it was very entertaining and worthwhile presentation. There's a couple of questions that popped up from let's see, Shannon Gordon asked, of all the descriptions of typical baseball games and teams seems to clash with the image of the Wild West. Were there any legendary violence or gambling in the West impact on the games?
Yeah, so I show it in my talk, the one thing where the baseball players finish the game and then they go rob a store. But the gambling and drinking was so prevalent in these games. And again, the image of the Old West where sober people actually go shooting against each other is largely a myth. It did happen a couple of times, but usually the gunfight happened when both people got into an argument. They were both dead drunk, and somebody cheated the other at a card game or betting. And so in these games, if they thought the umpire was favoring one team or the other, they suggest that the umpire start changing their decisions, or else when they were walking home, they would find a hole through their leg. So it was rough and tumble in the East. You can imagine it was rough and tumble ×2 out West.
Matt Albertson asked if the Western clubs in the states and territories are playing by the New York rules in the 1850s and early 1860s.
Oh, the question is whether they were playing by the New York rules at this time or some form of town ball or Massachusetts ball.
Right.
Oh, overwhelmingly or almost exclusively the New York game. Basically the Massachusetts game died out about 1867 in the East even. A couple of the early games in California were probably town ball or Massachusetts ball, call it what you will, but I'd say after 1867, 99.9% of the games were New York rules games. And we can see that several of the newspaper accounts specifically mention we're forming this team under the New York rules or under the National Association rules. So there's little doubt that the New York game was prevalent at this time.
Terry Gottschall made a comment about that date, 1867, using New York rules by the two teams at Walla Walla, Washington apparently played by the New York rules. So fits in with what you're saying there. Just for everybody, if you go through the chat, there's an extended little comment that Matt Lee puts that appeared in the Cincinnati Enquirer, quoting the Chicago Tribune about Chicago going to Minnesota to play a game, and it asked the writer inviting Sitting Bull to bring his team to the club. Bruce, thank you very much. It was a very nice talk, very well done. Thank you for your time and your effort. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
Peter, if you would close us up.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce. That was really very interesting. You had a few people chime in here. One, Terry Bone, who I think you know, who's going to be talking about South Dakota, but he wanted to know, and you can answer him online, I guess, by email, or if you know off the top of your head, the date of the first club in North Dakota, but that may require you to do a little.
Actually, I could do that off the top of my head.
Oh, okay.
I should say the first baseball in North Dakota, there was an Army expedition that established a Fort Abercrombie in North Dakota in 1863 or 64, and the soldiers played baseball, and that was what is now North Dakota. Of course, it was Dakota Territory back then. So, and that's in the Protoball database.
Okay, Terry, you got it. Also, Terry Gottschall says that the correct pronunciation is Clackamas for the town in Oregon.
I think my tongue got a little tangled up trying to do that there. So
and
our local wisdom.
And Eric Mikulich wants royalties because the photo that you showed of that vintage game actually is him pitching.
Oh, I owe you a beer, Eric.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
Okay. Thank you again very much, Bruce. We really appreciate it. You got also to a great start for the season 2 of the 19th Century Speaker Series. I just want to, before we close out, I just want to talk about a few things coming up, just in chronological order. So October 1st is our 19th Century Committee newsletter for the fall. Plenty of information in there. October the 12th, with 19th Century Baseball Speaker Series will continue with Mike Herbert doing William Holbert gives birth to baseball, to the business of baseball. And of course, he chairs the Business of Baseball Committee, or co-chairs it. And that'll be a great presentation. There was a shorter version done at the Fred several years ago, but he'll have a little bit more time this time. On October 31st, only about 6 weeks from now, mark your calendars, the Fred abstracts are due. So you can double check in the newsletter. It says a few words about a 200 to 400 word abstract if you want to enter a research presentation. November the 13th and 14th is the Brooklyn Symposium, Interdisciplinary Symposium, with Tom Gilbert being the events coordinator there. It'll be online via Zoom. It'll include on Sunday about a 90-minute tour of historic baseball sites via video and YouTube. And Tom will narrate and then go live to answer questions about that tour. How to register for the Brooklyn Symposium is contained in the newsletter. Thanksgiving, we'll have the jury results of the Fred abstracts, and January 1st, our Fred registration begins. Do not fear submitting an abstract. We will make a decision as time goes by whether or not the Fred, which we have planned as a live event in Cooperstown, but in the event that we're in some way affected by the pandemic, we will switch again to a Zoom. And I will hold the checks this time before sending them to SABR to expedite any kind of refunds or anything like that. But please enter your research presentation abstract if you're interested, because one way or the other, we will have a friend, and hopefully it'll be live. Okay. All right, but anyway, I want to thank you all. Bob, thank you again for being such a good host to this thing and getting us going on this. I thank you all
Thank
for
everybody.
tuning in.
Have a good
Yeah.
have a good night.
Peter?
and-
Yes.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Peter, a couple of questions, if you don't mind. I went on a couple of minutes late and said something about happening every 2 weeks. What's happening every 2 weeks? Or did I misunderstand?
I'm sorry, say that again, Mitch.
When I first logged in, it was around 8:02, 8:03. You were talking about something that was going on every 2 weeks, or did I misinterpret something?
No, you mean the 19th Century Baseball Speaker Series will be once a month.
No, but you were talking about something that was happening every 2 weeks, something other than that.
Oh, no, in 2 weeks' time, you'll see the newsletter come out.
Okay.
19th
Oh,
Century Committee
okay. Now
Newsletter.
that brings my second one. How do we get a copy of this newsletter?
Actually, you can just go right on to the SABR website and the 19th century, on the research committees, 19th century. You click on it, there's an entire archive of the newsletter, including the current one, which will be coming out around October the 1st,
And how often do they print it? Every month? Every 2 months?
quarterly.
Quarterly. Okay.
Yeah, it's a quarterly newsletter, and you get, if anybody that's a member of the 19th Century Committee and has an email address on file with SABR has a copy sent to them automatically.
I don't get a copy. I don't even get the. I gotta keep
Yeah, well,
up-
Mitch, there's some kind of a problem that Mitch has. We can't figure it out. I had Jacob
Oh, okay.
look at it. We can't figure it out. He's in the committee, his email's on the committee,
Yeah.
but for some reason, he's not getting notices from
And I
us.
gotta keep on annoying Peter all the time for.
It's all right.
It's one of my favorite pastimes.
So I mean, so you said the newsletters I can get on online. Just go to the SABR and the 19th Century. Click on 19th Century. You'll get all the newsletters.
That's correct, and they're posted within a day of the release.
Okay. Now you say people are getting them via email when they're coming out.
Yeah, but apparently there's some system glitch that you and Peter. tried
Yeah,
to
I'm not
raise.
getting anything. I got to keep on calling Peter to
Okay.
find out about the speaker series every month.
Okay, well, we'll keep working on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
Okay.
All right,
Okay.
Peter.
Hey.
Thank you very much, Peter. And it's a busy fall, and we'll have a busy spring. So that the 19th Century Committee keeps active. Appreciate everybody spending their time with us tonight. See you all next month. Any questions or comments about this, you're welcome to send them to Peter and I. And we'll look forward to seeing you when Mike Halpert presents his talk on William Hulbert and the business of baseball.
Okay, I'm sorry. Your name is Bob Bailey?
Last time I checked, yes.
Because I looked at the thing, it just says SABR virtual.
That's because I'm the host here running this whole. I'm walking off the SABR site.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So you're the famous Bob Bailey I keep on hearing about. Okay.
Infamous, maybe.
Yeah, and that's the same one that played for the Pirates 50 years ago.
Yeah, no. Although I've been asked for autographs, but I never got the bonus money.
All right, Bob, thank you
Okay.
again.
Hmm.
Good to see everybody again.
Hmm.
Len, was the grammar all correct? Okay. Be well, everyone.
All right. Take care.
Good night, all.
Good night, everyone.
All right.